Now, we are going to dive into the story, and there's a lot here to talk about. And this is a familiar story, I would imagine, for most of you, right? You've probably read this story a bunch. You probably heard it a bunch, or you at least had a lot of children's Bible classes about this story. So let's take some time to read it, at least a part of it. We're going to read the first 8 verses, and then we'll pick up in verse 16. And then let's dive into it and talk about it some more, okay? From chapter 18 of 1 Kings, the word of the Lord. Later on, in the 3rd year of the drought, the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain." So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. Meanwhile, the famine had become very severe in Samaria. So Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace. Obadiah was a devoted follower of the Lord. Once, when Jezebel had tried to kill all the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had hidden 100 of them in 2 caves. He put 50 prophets in each cave and supplied them with food and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, "We must check every spring and valley in the land to see if we can find enough grass to save at least some of my horses and mules." So they divided the land between them. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way by himself. As Obadiah was walking along, he suddenly saw Elijah coming toward him. Obadiah recognized him at once and bowed low to the ground before him. "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" he asked. "Yes, it is," Elijah replied. "Now go and tell your master, Elijah is here." Jump down to verse 16 with me. So Obadiah went to tell Ahab that Elijah had come, and Ahab went out to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw him, he exclaimed, "So, is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel?" "I have made no trouble for Israel," Elijah replied. "You and your family are the troublemakers, for you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who are supported by Jezebel." So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people were completely silent. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only prophet of the Lord who was left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God." And all the people agreed. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it, and call on the name of your God. Do not set fire to the wood." So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "Oh, Baal, answer us!" But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming. Maybe he's relieving himself. Or maybe he's away on a trip, or is asleep and needs to be awakened." So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, no response. Then Elijah called to the people, "Come over here." They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. he took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar, large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour the water over the offering and the wood." If you've ever made a home fire, I don't recommend this way to build a fire. After they had done this, he said, "Do the same again." And when they were finished, he said, "Now a 3rd time." So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately, the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, He is God. Yes, the Lord is God." It's a beautiful story, right? It's really wonderful in so many ways. The details are what pull it together and make it such a wonderful story. I want to talk about the major people here as we begin. I want to talk about the major people that we see in this story. And I want to begin with Ahab and Jezebel. The truth is, we can't begin this chapter without thinking back to what we talked about last week, right? As we go through this journey of the Old Testament, it only makes sense that these things connect, right? That they're not these broken pieces along the way, but there's a thread and a narrative that weaves in and out of these. And of course, the thread here, who was it that led the northern tribes into false worship of Baal? Jeroboam. About 35 years before the time of Ahab. Remember last week we talked about Rehoboam and Jeroboam and how he created these golden calves at Dan and Bethel, and how he led the people away from worshiping the true God, from worshiping Yahweh. So we have these 2 locations. And I told you last week that the sin of Jeroboam trickled down into every single northern king. I wasn't lying. You can see clearly in this chapter how what Jeroboam did affected the people of the north and affected Ahab and Jezebel in particular, who are 2 particularly very wicked people. Ahab is argued to be maybe the worst king in the north, and I think that's partly because of his wicked wife as well. Because Jezebel hurts the people even more by what she does and the ways that she encourages them to turn away from the true and living God. So the worship of Baal became commonplace. The god of Asherah was enshrined alongside the worship of Baal. And so you have these 2 false gods set before the people. And they're faced with a choice. What are we going to do? Are we going to stay true to the Lord or not? And we're going to talk about Obadiah and the people that he hid in just a moment. Because there certainly were people who were remaining true to the Lord, right? But the rest of the people, what are they going to do? Are they going to continue to worship God? Are they going to follow these false idols? And so on top of the worship of these false gods, Jezebel had attempted to destroy all of the prophets of the Lord remaining in Israel. And so it was time for something big to happen. Something needed to happen to them so that they could be called back to the true God, to the only true and living God that was available to them. They needed something big to happen. And so along comes Obadiah and Elijah. Obadiah and Elijah are also very important characters in the story, right? Obadiah has a seemingly minor role, right? He's only mentioned a couple of times, but he's actually a very, very important person. So when Jezebel had attempted to kill all these prophets, what did Obadiah do? He secretly hid 100 of them. He hid them in caves and provided them with food and water. And remember, in verse 1, at the very beginning of the story, how does it begin? What are they in the midst of? Drought. What do you not have during a drought? Water. Food, because crops can't grow. Because cattle don't have anywhere to drink. And in fact, we see how Ahab measures the lives of people versus the lives of his own livestock, right? How he tells Obadiah, hey, I'm going to go one way, you're going to go another, not to save our people, but to save what? To save my cattle. My mules need to be fed, and they need water. Yeah, the people are dying, but my stuff is more important. So what do we see Obadiah do with the prophets of the Lord? He hides them, and he provides for them. What great cost it must have been to him to do that. He was quite literally putting his own life on the line for the sake of these people. Because for 3 years, there have been no new crops. For 3 years, the people have been struggling to find water. And the fact that Obadiah was willing to risk his life by providing the Lord's priests and prophets with food and water is remarkable and admirable. Obadiah's way of serving the Lord was very different than Elijah's, right? Elijah was the sort of prophet we tend to think about in all these Old Testament stories. He's out there, he's in your face, right? He's calling the people back to God. He's telling it like it is to the powers that, that's who he is, right? He's the guy that we get behind and we rally around and like, yeah, Elijah, go get him, right? And Obadiah is just this quiet person secretly working in the midst of this terrible kingship, this terrible regime in Israel, all the time undercutting them and what they're doing, right? Working behind the backs of Ahab and Jezebel to continue to support and work for the Lord. Obadiah was just as committed to the Lord as Elijah was. He attempted to serve the Lord in a very different sort of way, and he did so by subversion right under Ahab's and Jezebel's noses. It took strength, great strength from Obadiah to live this way, to remain at his post and to work for the Lord while Ahab did all sorts of horrible things around him. How easy would it have been for Obadiah to say, you know what? I can't work for this guy any longer. I got to get out of this palace. I got to get away from this king and queen. They're literally pulling me down, right? I got to get away. He could have done that. But instead, he stayed in the fight, right? He secretly stayed in the fight on the Lord's behalf, protecting the people that he could. Then we have Elijah, on the other hand, who he's a prophet in the wild, right? And the descriptions of him in the Bible mirror the descriptions that we see of John the Baptist in the New Testament, right? Where he wears this coarse clothing, right? These camel hides or whatever, and he's out there eating locusts and other disgusting things. Yeah, I see your face. No locusts. We're having potluck today, by the way. If anybody made locusts, take it home. Just get it out. I don't want it. But potluck today. Potluck. You thought I would forget about that. I'm not going to forget about potluck. Elijah's out there in the wild, living off the land, calling the people back to the Lord. His role as a prophet was to call the people back. It was to remind them who the true God is. He was a prophet who used his voice, right? You can see the thanks it garnered for him publicly from Ahab. Ahab viewed him as a troublemaker. Ahab sought to kill him for many years. He blamed everything on Elijah. It was Elijah's fault that they were in the drought. So when he sees him, he says, "Is that you troublemaker of Israel?" And I like how Elijah throws it right back in his face. I'm not the one who caused trouble. You and your sin and your family's sin have caused the trouble for Israel. Elijah wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. Obadiah didn't use his voice so much as his hands and feet, right, to help. Elijah used his voice. Elijah didn't have a place in the king's court. He wasn't going to be the one before the king, and in front of his whole entourage, right, as he's seated up on the throne. Elijah wasn't welcome there. Elijah wasn't welcome to speak to the king in those moments. He couldn't effect change from within. Elijah was the kind of prophet who had to do it from without. Obadiah, on the other hand, had his place in the court. But Elijah could be an example out among the people, and he absolutely was. We see that over and over again from him in his life. It never ceases to amaze me how God is never working just one angle. I think we often think that. We often feel like Elijah did. Right? Elijah, in this very story, says, I'm the only prophet of God left. I'm the only one who actually worships the Lord. But what do we know, good readers of the story? No, there are at least 101 others who are not bowing down to these false gods. Elijah felt all alone. See, God wasn't working just one angle. God didn't throw all of his chips into one basket, right? He wasn't betting it all on Elijah to do this. God was working in other people as well. Sometimes when we work and live for God, we feel alone. Sometimes we feel like it's us against the world. And nobody else is going to back me up. And nobody's going to support me. And God has left me on my own to do this by myself. That couldn't be further from the truth. And this story helps show us that. This story helps show us that Elijah, though he felt alone, was far, far from it. The last major important person that we need to talk about is Baal, or if you're from the south, his name is Baal. This Baal, clearly his name came from the south. Baal. The Hebrew word is actually Baal. And what's interesting about the Hebrew word is it literally means husband or man. Danny is Baal. I am Baal. What does the hair have to do with it? You say with people... I didn't call you bald. I would have pointed at somebody else. Never mind. Baal has a certain meaning in the Hebrew, but it comes to be used of this god, this false god, this idol, this thing that the people worshipped. So it's important to understand who this god, right? I'm little g, okay, Basil, little g. It's important to understand who this God was. What was he a God, little g, God of? Well, there are many texts outside the Bible that actually talk about this God. There are actually several statues that we found, not me, right, but we, that's a royal we, the collective we, that archaeologists have found in excavating many sites throughout the Middle East. They found statues of this God. We know that he was a storm god. Hold that in your mind. What are the people going through right now in the story? Drought. But he's their storm god. Okay? He's the God of thunder, the God of lightning, the God of rain, and a God associated with fertility, in particular in the springtime, right? As things are blooming and coming to life. He was often depicted as holding lightning bolts, holding a drum to represent thunder, right? The loud booming. This is Baal. As you consider the story, and you think about what happens in this moment, it makes it all the funnier, right? It makes the story even more ironic as you think about that detail of who this God was and the fact that he couldn't show up when he was most needed to do the very thing that he's supposed to do, which is provide fire. All right. Now let's talk about prophets and power in this story here for a moment. I want to talk about prophets and kind of give a more broad kind of look at prophets. Because what was the role of a prophet, right? Is prophecy all about fortune or future telling? That's what we often think about prophecy. Well, the short answer, of course, is no. Although there are many prophets at many times who did do those sorts of things, right? They did talk about the ways in which God would continue to live and work and act in the world, right? And that's fine. But there were two main types of prophets in Israel, and we actually see both of them in the story. There were court prophets. Obadiah is a court prophet. We see another one, another prominent one in Scripture, and that is Nathan. Nathan, a prophet to King David. Remember when David had his episode, kind of the best thing we can call it, with Bathsheba, when he took advantage of Bathsheba and then murdered Uriah and attempted to cover it up? Nathan, the prophet, is the one who confronted him. Nathan was a prophet who lived in the palace. He was around David all the time. He had that kind of relationship with him. He was welcome in that space. The court prophet was God's mouthpiece to the king. And their role was to seek God's wisdom and instruction for the people, but particularly wisdom for the king to rule wisely and to rule justly. David wasn't the only king that welcomed these sorts of prophets into the court. Again, we see Ahab here with Obadiah. Then alternatively, you had prophets among the people, the out there prophets. And Elijah absolutely represents those. These were the prophets who performed a lot of the sign acts, right? A lot of the miracles that we think about in the Old Testament. Those are the sorts of prophets that we think about. And Elijah was one of these. Though we do not see that, he had a lot of standing in Israel's court, he could sometimes go there, but his main objective was to be among the people. But no matter the type of prophet that you think about in the Old Testament, the prophet's main role was to call the people, and if they were a court prophet, the king or queen, out of complacency. I want you to think about that word complacency here for a moment. Because that's a tough word for us to deal with sometimes. We like for things in our lives to be settled, don't we? We like for things in our lives to go well. And if we find a good rhythm where things are going well, even if it's not quite where God wants us to be, sometimes we find ourselves complacent in those moments. Letting them come and go because, well, I'm not really hurting myself right now. I'm not hurting other people. I know I'm not quite where God wants me to be, but this feels good. I'm happy right now. I don't want to upset the status quo. The prophet was the person who was called by God to come alongside the people who felt that way and say, snap out of it. Focus on God. The prophet wasn't content to let the people continue in their sin. They gave their lives, and I mean that literally, as Jesus himself said, you killed the prophets before me, right? And what he's saying by that is, you're going to kill me too. Because he also was a prophet in Israel. They gave their lives in service of God. And so we see in the story how Elijah isn't content to let the people continue to worship this false god, these false gods, as we have Baal and Asherah in the story. He can't stand by as they pursue their collective life of sin. And so he put before them the question in this story, is Yahweh the true God or not? Is Yahweh the true God or not? And that question can only actually be answered by who holds the real power. So I want to talk about power here as we close out this story. Again, think about Baal and everything that I told you a few minutes ago that we know about this little g god. There was a 3-year drought going on. So, hello, storm god? What's going on? Right? Are you going to show up or not? When the people cried out, they must surely have thought that he would send lightning upon the altar to strike it and cause the fire. But of course, that didn't happen. This false god remained silent, as we all knew that he must. And so what did Elijah do? I love Elijah in this story. He begins mocking the people. And maybe that's because that's kind of who I am. I'm like a mocker. It's not a good thing. There's something in Proverbs that talks about mockers, isn't there? Maybe I should stop that. But Elijah does. Elijah mocks the people in this moment, doesn't he? Right? Cry out louder. Maybe he's just asleep. He'll hear you after you get loud enough, right? And you think, 450 prophets of Baal, 400 of Asherah, so 850 people can make a lot of noise, can't they? And yet this God remains silent. There's an eerie sort of silence from the heavens in this moment. And what's really interesting is that for all intents and purposes, this showdown happens on Baal's turf. Right? They have this location at Mount Carmel that this is Baal's area. They believe that he rules these mountains. He's the one who brings those storms up from the sea over our people so that we can get rain. He's the one who provides for our crops in this way, not Yahweh of the south. That God is in the south. This is Baal's home turf. The showdown happened in the northern kingdom where this God is in charge, supposedly. Yet he couldn't do what was needed. He failed. He failed even on his home turf, right? Home field advantage is supposed to matter, isn't it? Reminds me of a little thing called the World Series recently where home field advantage didn't seem to matter either. I'm sorry, Lacey. Lacey's a big Astros fan, if you didn't know. And they lost, didn't they, Lacey? Okay. I hate to remind you, I'm sorry. I'm not mocking. See, this is bad. This is bad. I'm not a good person. All right. I am. Baal fails even on his home turf. He can't win against the true God, can he? So Elijah was able to laugh in the face of this established power, this authority, right, that's supposed to be in control of these people. He's able to laugh in the face of this false power. And he not only mocked the people and their God, when it was time for Yahweh to act, Elijah used 12 stones, right? And that number is not insignificant at all. And he had the people dump from 12 jars, again, the number not being insignificant. And he asked them to dump 12 times, right? Again, this number coming out each and every time, reminding them, we are a divided people, but God, we have one God over all of us, one true and living God over all of us. And what does he use to soak the altar? Water. What are they in need of at this moment? How could he use water so egregiously in this moment, right? I mean, what were the people thinking? Hold on. My kids haven't had water in 2 weeks. I mean, obviously they can't go that long, but you know what I mean. They haven't had water in a day. Give them some of that. And Elijah says, hold on. We got to make this really good, you know. We got to prove how powerful Yahweh truly is in this moment. So Elijah refused to make the easy choice here. See, the other prophets had it easy. They got to sit at court. They got to sit at the table of Ahab and Jezebel, feasting on the choicest foods, drinking the finest wines. They chose support for their government over support for their God. And in so doing, they compromised their faith and their lives. What's really interesting is what they end up crying out. What did they cry out at the very end of the story? The Lord, He is God. Elijah's name means, my God is Yahweh. That's what the name Eliyahu means. Essentially, what do they end up crying out? Elijah, Elijah, at the end of the story. It's really fascinating how the story ends. Elijah, the troublemaking prophet, right? The mocker comes on the scene, representing the power of the Lord, the true and living God. And what do the people end up crying out? They end up crying out this prophet's name, but as a representation of the Lord, right? We talked a few weeks ago about the name Yahweh. We connected it to the name Jesus. How Paul says in Philippians chapter 2 that at the name of Jesus, every knee is going to bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that He is Lord to the glory of God the Father. What did the people do here? They fell down, crying out the name Yahweh. It's a beautiful picture of what's to come. We long for that day when everybody recognizes recognizes the authority and the power of the true and living God. We want it to happen now, right? Each and every one of us want that now. It's probably not going to happen. There's probably still going to be people who refuse to call out the name of God. But if we live like Obadiah and Elijah did, maybe we can effect some change. And so to conclude today, the first question is, are you an Obadiah or an Elijah? Remember, both of these prophets are called to resist, right? Both of these prophets speak out in their own way against the false worship. Now, not everyone is a prophet, right? I understand that. Not everyone is a prophet. And that's something we need to understand as well, that not everyone is a prophet. But that's precisely the point of this question. What kind of prophet can you be? We often view prophets as only those who are like Elijah, right? The in-your-face, upfront and personal, hey, get right with Jesus sort of people. And those people are good. We need those people. But those aren't the only sorts of people that God is calling to be used on His behalf. You could just as easily be an Obadiah who works behind the scenes in just as impactful and powerful ways, right? Obadiah, without Obadiah, what would have happened to those 100 prophets? Elijah truly would have been alone in that moment, right? But because of Obadiah's strength, because of his willingness to serve the Lord, Elijah isn't the only one not bowing down. We need Obadiahs and Elijahs in this world. The last thing that I want to do, the last takeaway, is I want to read from Psalm 115. It's a psalm that I would venture you all know. It has reflections in the prophets as well, Isaiah in particular. It's a really powerful psalm. I want to read a few verses from it, and then we'll conclude. Think about this psalm in light of the story that we've just read and talked about. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name goes all the glory, for your unfailing love and faithfulness. Why let the nation say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens, and He does as He wishes. Their idols are merely things of silver and gold, shaped by human hands. They have mouths, but cannot speak, and eyes, but cannot see. They have ears, but cannot hear, and noses, but cannot smell. They have hands, but cannot feel, and feet, but cannot walk, and throats, but cannot make a sound. And those who make idols are just like them, as are all who trust in them. O Israel, trust the Lord. He is your help and your shield. O priests, descendants of Aaron, trust the Lord. He is your helper and your shield. All who fear the Lord, trust the Lord. He is your helper and your shield. All who fear the Lord, trust the Lord. He is your helper and your shield. Elijah was reminded of that in this moment on Mount Carmel. Lord is his helper and his shield. I certainly hope it's not going to take fire raining down on an altar soaked with lots of water to get your attention, to make the Lord your helper and your shield. What kind of prophet are you going to be this week? Are you going to be the in-your-face sort of prophet? Basil does that really well. Right? I think most of us, as I was talking about this, are thinking, hey, that's Basil. Not an in-your-face sort of bad way, Basil. I mean that in a very positive way. Some of you aren't like that. You know what? That's okay. It's okay to not be like Basil. It's okay for Basil to not be like you. But you got to be some kind of person that's living for God, right? You can't be like the prophets who gave up on God. So are you going to be an Obadiah or Elijah this week in your life? It's a powerful story. There's a lot to learn, and there's a lot else from Elijah's life that we could look at and glean from, but one week will do us. We're going to move on from Elijah next week to Hosea chapter 11. Don't forget we have food after class. Okay, I'm just going to put my last plug in for food. What kind of people are we going to be this week? That's what this story leaves us with. As we stand and sing here in a moment, you have the opportunity to let us know about things that are going on in your life. Thanksgivings, right? Things that are making you happy that you're so thankful to God for. Or maybe things in your life for which you need prayers. For all of those things, we are here to welcome and receive you and pray and support you on your behalf. So come forward as we stand and sing.